Hi friends, my name's Teresa and this is a video on demonstrating literate practices through poetry. So when I think of a typical English teacher teaching a poetry unit, this is the kind of dialogue that runs through my head. Read this poem. Okay, what do you think of it? No, stop, wrong. The blue curtains symbolize death. Who can tell me what iambic pentameter is? No one? Okay, memorize these 3 poems for Friday. This exam will be the end of our poetry unit. That is not why we read poetry. In a TED Talk, poetry critic Stephen Burt says, "The patterns in poems show us not just what somebody thought or what someone did or what happened, but what it was like to be a person like that, to be so anxious, so lonely, so inquisitive, so goofy, so preposterous, so brave." Though a poem doesn't make things happen, it happens every time someone reads it. Without a reader, a poem is nothing but an imprint, the residue of an idea one writer had once. Burt says in his talk, "Poetry helps me want to be alive." So what is the purpose then of reading poetry? We read poetry to feel something, to derive meaning, to make connections, to keep an idea alive, and to remember. This isn't to say there's no face value in learning the technical vocabulary of poetry. But students already know how to read poems. They just might not know how to read them as experts or on a deeper level than they already know. For example, students already know that certain words and sentences carry different levels of power. They just don't know that this is called diction and syntax. Students already know a lot, but as secondary language arts educators, we need to show them what tools we use to derive meaning from poems. In other words, our literary practices. These quotes from Daniels and Zemmelman, I think, outline this very well. We're really good at commanding kids to read, but not nearly as good at showing them how to read. While we cannot literally open up our heads for kids to watch the neurons firing, we can learn to report what is happening in our minds as we think through the text. If we want students to read how we read, we need to model the whole process for them first, by showing them our literate practices. We need to read the poem out loud to them and literally stop ourselves and tell them the questions we ask ourselves in our heads while reading, telling them the predictions we make and the inferences we're making, as well as the sources we use to locate those answers through the research we do and the text itself. Only then, when they can fully comprehend what we're doing and how we read a text, can we ask them to ask questions themselves and to seek answers themselves, to continue reading and to continue applying literate practices on their own. So to better show you guys what I mean by when I say demonstrate your literate practices for your students, I'm going to do that by doing a pre-reading of London by William Blake and showing you guys the different literate practices that I use in a pre-reading. Before that too, I have a couple points about getting students interested in the material they're about to read. I think it's important to gauge student interest and their comfort level with poetry before anything. Ask students about their initial impressions of poems just to get them thinking and in the poetry mindset. Maybe make it a daily practice. You could have students draw a picture while you read the poems out loud. You could have them think about and respond to pre-reading questions like, what do you think about political conflict? What is the relationship between art and civics? What's the relationship between art and poetry? And can poetry affect war? These are all questions that relate to London by William Blake, and will get them thinking about the poem and its context. So to model pre-reading for a class, this is what I would do. So we have this poem, and at a glance, I can see a bunch of different things. The first thing I'm probably going to look at is the title and the author here. I don't really know who William Blake is if I'm a student encountering this poem for the first time. I don't know what connection he has to London, so I'm probably going to want to do some research into his history, see his background. I also see a lot of words here that I don't necessarily know the definition of. Um, so to so my literate practice with that would be to make myself a little cheat sheet with all the definitions of words that I don't necessarily understand at first glance. And that'll, help me to understand the poem in a different context later. I also might have a list of some poetic terms, references, just things common around this time period, the French Revolution, kind of want some background on that, similes, metaphors, lyric, hyperbole. These are all things that relate to this poem and can be found in it. You could give your students these lists ahead of time and just ask them to keep them in the back of their mind, but they aren't necessarily things that they need right away in order to understand the poem. These might be things that come later. But yeah, with a pre-reading, we're looking at the title, the author, words we don't understand. I can see that there's 4 stanzas here, each with 4 lines. Wondering, why did the author do that? That's interesting. What is his intention there? Even just by looking at the last word of each line here, I can see that there's a rhyme scheme. We have street and meet, flow and woe, man, ban, fear here. Like, these are all things that I can just see upon, 15 seconds of looking at this poem. So to go back to the history and biography of Blake, I found just a quick kind of summary of his life, his education, visions that he had, what he did for work. And these are all things essential to Blake that will help us better understand his poems and where he's coming from and what he's writing about. We could also look at the original poem itself here, because Blake did create his own pictures for each poem, and we can look at that as a primary text too and think about the relationship between the picture here and the poem. There's a lot going on, and this already gives me a big initial impression of what the poem's going to be about without even actually delving into it yet already. So yeah, these were things that I would want to model to students, show them what's going on in my head, show them that I'm asking questions about the title and about the author, asking questions and making inferences about the stanza, the form, the word choice here. I'm asking questions about the time period this took place and the context, the history, even much before I delve into the poem, before I even actually read it. So that would be a literate practice that I would use for my students. I also put some more tips here for during reading, actually reading a poem. I won't go over all of these, but I'll kind of just leave them here. I think it's really important to model annotation for your students also. I could have been annotating with my pre-reading, making inferences about the title and the different words, circling words that I didn't know or understand. It looks like this person, with each reading of the poem, used a different color pen to mark their thoughts and took notes on the structure and the form down here. This would be a good way to model pre-reading for your students too. And this is just another way of doing it with a graphic organizer. Sections about the title, paraphrasing certain lines, the connotation of certain lines, the attitude of the poem, the shift, thinking about the title again, and the overall theme of the poem. Both of these are a good guide, I think, for actually doing the reading itself of the poem. And then there's just some more notes here on post-reading of the poem. making sure that you reflect, integrate, and share ideas, synthesizing ideas to make larger inferences and connections, following up on questions and considering whether you've learned new answers, found surprises, developed a new perspective, or have new questions. Again, these things are all very easy to tell students to do and expect them to just understand how to do it. But both the during reading, annotation, and graphic organizer thing, and the post reading here, the kind of general outline of this should be modeled for your students. Show them actually how you think about reflection and how you integrate ideas and share your ideas. How do you synthesize ideas? And how do you connect whether you've learned anything or not? So yeah, I hope that you guys learned something about developing literate practices and showcasing them for your students in order for them to really understand our brains and how we make meaning of a text. Right, and thank you.